In the autumn of 1580, a galleon named Nuestra Señora de la Concepción rode low into the harbor of Seville, her holds packed so tightly with silver bars from the New World that her timbers groaned against the weight. The dock workers had to bring out the heavier cranes. The clerks of the Casa de Contratación stood with their ledgers open, ink already drying, in the warm Andalusian air, waiting to count a fortune that would arrive in carts pulled by oxen down the cobbled streets toward the royal treasury. The king who owned that silver, Philip II of Spain, was at that very moment the most powerful monarch on earth. He ruled territory on 4 continents. His mints stamped coins that traded as money in Manila, in Antwerp, in Nagasaki, in Lima. And within 10 years of that galleon docking, that same king would have defaulted on his sovereign debts 4 separate times. 4 bankruptcies, in one reign, by the richest man in the world. That is the story we are going to walk through tonight. Not as a curiosity, not as a footnote in some textbook about Habsburg succession, but as one of the cleanest case studies in financial history of what happens when a nation mistakes resource extraction for genuine wealth, because the Spanish Empire at its peak controlled more land, more people, and more bullion than any state Europe had ever produced. The Spanish silver real became the world's first global currency, accepted in markets that had never heard of Madrid. Spanish ships moved cargo across oceans no European had crossed a century earlier, and yet, despite all of it, despite the mountain of silver, despite the galleons, despite the colonies that stretched from California to the Philippines, Spain ended the 17th century as one of the poorest, most indebted, most industrially hollowed-out powers in Europe. The brokest empire on the continent, the original resource curse. How does that happen? How does a country that imports the largest concentration of precious metal in human history go bankrupt over and over and over again? That is the ledger we are about to open. It begins, the way these stories so often begin, with a mountain. In 1545, a few decades after the conquest of the Inca, indigenous llama herder named Diego Gualpa was searching for a lost animal on a wind-swept peak in the Bolivian highlands, more than 4,000 meters above sea level. He stumbled. He grabbed at a shrub to catch himself. The roots came up in his hand, and clinging to them was ore so rich it glittered in the thin mountain sunlight. That mountain became known as Cerro Rico, the Rich Hill, and the city that grew at its base became Potosi. Within a generation, Potosi would be one of the largest cities in the world, larger than London, larger than Madrid, a brawling boomtown at altitudes where the air itself thinned the lungs, where the Spanish crown extracted a fortune that historians still struggle to fully tally. To pull that silver from the rock, the Spanish revived and weaponized an old Andean labor obligation called the mita. Under Inca rule, it had been a rotating community duty, a way to pool labor for public works. Under the Spanish, it became something else entirely. Indigenous villages across a vast swath of the viceroyalty were required to send a percentage of their adult men, year after year, to descend into the shafts of Cerro Rico. They worked in conditions that killed a great many of them, from accidents, from silicosis, from mercury poisoning in the amalgamation patios where the silver was separated from the ore. The mita was not the only labor system at Potosi, and historians continue to debate exact mortality figures, but the human cost of the silver that built Spanish power is not a number any honest accounting can leave out of the ledger. The silver came up. It was smelted into bars, stamped with the royal seal, loaded onto mule trains, and walked down out of the mountains toward the Pacific coast. From there, it sailed north to Panama, crossed the isthmus on the backs of more mules, was reloaded onto the Atlantic, treasure fleets, and convoyed under guard across the ocean toward Seville. A second route, opened in 1565, sent silver westward across the Pacific from Acapulco on the Manila Galleon, where Spanish silver met Chinese silk and porcelain in the markets of the Philippines, and the silver flowed onward into the vast monetary appetite of Ming China. For the first time in history, a single currency moved continuously around the world. In Seville, the Casa de Contratación managed the entire commercial machinery of the empire. Every ship, every cargo, every passenger to and from the Americas was registered there. The streets of the city filled with silversmiths, with bankers, with merchants from Genoa and Augsburg and Florence, all of them clustered around the river port where the fleets came in. Visitors described churches whose altars dripped with worked silver, processions where the metal was hammered into shapes more ornate than anything Europe had ever seen. By the late 16th century, the volume of bullion flowing into Spanish ports had no precedent in recorded commerce. Historical estimates of total American silver shipped to Spain across the colonial period run into the range of more than 150,000 tons, with the bulk of it flowing in the century and a half after Potosi opened. It looked, from the outside, like the apotheosis of wealth. It was, from inside the royal counting houses, the beginning of a slow disaster. Here is the part that no one in Madrid wanted to say out loud. The silver was not making Spain rich, it was making Spain feel rich, which is a very different thing. Because when that much money pours into an economy that is not producing enough goods to absorb it, the money does not stay valuable. It dilutes, prices rise. The Spanish historian Earl Hamilton, working in the early 20th century, documented what economists now call the price revolution. Across the 16th century and into the 17th, prices in Spain and across much of Europe rose roughly sixfold. Spanish wheat, the bread on a peasant's table, multiplied in cost. Wages lagged behind. The very silver that the crown counted as a triumph was, in the same motion, eroding the purchasing power of every household that did not have direct access to the treasure fleets. Worse, the silver gave the crown a credit line it should never have had. Philip II did not wait for the fleets to arrive before he spent the money. He borrowed against them. He went to the great banking houses of the age, the Fuggers of Augsburg, who had financed his father Charles V's election as Holy Roman Emperor, and the Genoese banking syndicates clustered around the fairs of Besançon and later Piacenza, and he pledged future shipments as collateral against loans at compounding interest. The lenders, seeing the silver flow with their own eyes, agreed. The interest rates were heavy, sometimes brutally so, but the collateral seemed unimpeachable. There was, after all, a mountain. And so a feedback loop began. The king borrowed against the fleets arrived, the silver paid down some of the loans, but the interest and the wars and the building and the courts and the new loans always grew faster than the silver could keep up. Philip II inherited from his father a Europe at war and made it worse. He sent armies into the Netherlands to put down the Dutch. Revolt, a conflict that would consume Spanish treasure for 80 years. He fought the Ottoman Empire in the Mediterranean, won the great naval battle of Lepanto in 1571, and discovered that even victory was ruinous. He launched the Armada against England in 1588, lost most of it to storm and English gunnery, and absorbed a strategic and financial wound that never healed. Each campaign demanded silver in advance. Each campaign returned less than it cost. Think of silver, in the Spanish economy of this century, the way you might think of a great river that has burst its banks. From a distance, it looks like prosperity. Water everywhere, abundance, a landscape transformed. Up close, the water is in the houses. It is rotting the foundations. It is drowning the very fields it was supposed to irrigate. The silver did not water the Spanish economy. It flooded it, and a flood is not the same thing as a harvest. Now, before we walk through the bankruptcies themselves, and we are going to walk through them because the dates matter, pause on something that should sound familiar. A country whose primary export is a single extracted commodity. A government that grows dependent on the revenues that commodity generates. Domestic industries that wither because imported goods, paid for in commodity dollars, are always cheaper than what local artisans can produce. Sovereign borrowing collateralized against future extraction. Currency that holds its value only as long as the resource keeps flowing. That pattern did not die with the Habsburgs. Economists today have a name for it. They call it the resource curse, or sometimes Dutch disease, and they observe its symptoms in petrostates of the modern era. Countries whose oil or gas revenues prop up state budgets while non-resource sectors atrophy, whose currencies trade at levels that crush domestic manufacturing, whose treasuries borrow heavily against future commodity flows and then run into trouble when prices drop or production stalls. No two cases map perfectly, and modern monetary tools and diversified economies change the picture in ways Philip II would not recognize. But the underlying shape, wealth from the ground without industry above it, is older than the modern oil age. Spain wrote the first draft. So, let us walk the dates. In 1557, only a year after he ascended the throne, Philip II was forced to suspend payments to his creditors. This was the first of what historians count as the Great Spanish Royal Bankruptcies. The crown's debts had outrun its incoming silver. Short-term loans, called asientos, were converted by royal decree into long-term, lower-interest bonds called juros, which was, in plain terms, a default by another name. The Fuggers, the German banking dynasty that had bankrolled Spanish power for decades, took losses they would never fully recover from. The Genoese, more flexible, more diversified, more practiced at extracting concessions, stepped in to fill the gap and took an even larger share of future Spanish lending. The 1557 default did not collapse the empire. It rearranged who got paid first. 3 years later, in 1560, Philip suspended payments again. The treasury was, once more, empty. Once more, asientos were converted into juros. Once more, the bankers swallowed the loss and lent again, because the silver kept arriving and the collateral still looked sound on paper. In 1575, the third default. By now there was a pattern visible to anyone who cared to look. The crown was running a structural deficit that the silver fleets could not close. The wars in the Netherlands ground on. The Spanish armies in Flanders mutinied repeatedly when their wages went unpaid, and in 1576, troops who had not been paid for months sacked the city of Antwerp, at the time one of the wealthiest commercial centers in Europe. The event was so brutal it acquired a name, the Spanish Fury, and it accelerated the very Dutch revolt the troops had been sent to suppress. The 1575 default did not just cost the crown its credit, it cost it the goose. In 1596, the fourth default of Philip II's reign. By this point, even the Genoese bankers, the most patient lenders in Europe, were beginning to calculate carefully how much exposure they could absorb. The silver was still arriving. The mountain at Potosi was still being torn open, but the rate at which the crown could borrow and the rate at which it could repay had decoupled so completely that the whole machinery was being held together by repeated, formal admissions that the king could not pay what he owed. Philip II died in 1598. The bankruptcies did not die with him. In 1607, his son Philip III defaulted. In 1627, his grandson Philip IV defaulted. In 1647, again. In 1652. In 1662. The 17th century in Spain was a century of sovereign suspensions, each one rearranging the relationship between the crown and its creditors, each one chipping away at the credit of the Spanish state, each one signaling that the silver was no longer enough. And here is the deeper damage, the thing that does not show up in a list of default dates. Across all those decades, while the silver poured in and the loans piled up and the wars consumed everything, Spanish domestic industry was being hollowed out. Why would a Castilian weaver compete with cheaper textiles imported from Flanders or England, paid for with American silver? Why would a Spanish ironworker build out his forge when imported iron was already on the docks? The silver, instead of capitalizing Spanish workshops, flowed straight through Spain and out the other side, into the hands of foreign producers who took Spanish coin in exchange for finished goods. By the middle of the 17th century, observers were openly remarking that Spain had become a kind of conduit. Silver came in from the Americas, paused briefly in Seville, and continued on into the manufacturing economies of Northern Europe and Asia. I want to pause here for a moment, because there is something genuinely counterintuitive about all this, and it deserves to be said plainly. When you first encounter this story, the instinct is to assume that more money has to be better, that a country with that much silver had to be wealthy in some real sense. It feels strange that more money could make a country poorer. It feels almost backwards. But money is not the same as wealth. Wealth is what a society can produce, what it can build, what its people can make with their hands and their minds. Money is the claim ticket. If the claim tickets multiply but the underlying production does not, you do not have more wealth. You have inflation, and if your claim tickets buy other people's production instead of stimulating your own, you have an economy that is slowly forgetting how to make things. That, in the end, is what happened to Spain. Picture for a moment the silence in a Seville accounting house on the morning of one of those announcements, the day the crown's officers came, to tell the merchants that another asiento had been frozen, another suspension declared. Not chaos, not shouting, just a long, dry silence, the kind that settles when men who deal in numbers all day understand at once that the numbers they have been counting on are not going to be paid. And on the other side of the world, a very different sound. The Potosí mills at the Cerro Rico, wooden stamping rigs powered by water and animal labor, grinding ore into dust at altitudes where every breath came short. A deafening, repetitive pounding that ran day and night, year after year, the soundtrack of an empire whose treasure was being torn out of a single mountain by men who would mostly never see a single coin minted from what they pulled up. Two sounds, the pounding of the mills and the silence of the counting house. They are the same story, told from opposite ends of the supply chain. The Fugger banking family deserves its own line here, because their fate is the financial fate of Spain in miniature. The Fuggers of Augsburg had been the great German banking dynasty of the 16th century, the lenders to emperors, the family whose loans elected Charles V. They tied their fortunes to the Habsburgs. They lent and lent and lent. And when the defaults came, 1557, 1575, 1596, the Fuggers absorbed losses that gradually drained the wealth their founder had spent a lifetime building. By the middle of the 17th century, the family that had once held the credit of an empire in its ledger books was a shadow of itself. They went down with the ship they had financed. The Genoese, who replaced the Fuggers as Spain's principal bankers in the latter 16th century, were more careful. They diversified. They negotiated harder. They charged for the risk. They survived where the Fuggers did not, and Genoa itself, that small city republic on the Ligurian coast, became one of the great financial centers of the 17th century, in large part on the back of its careful, profitable, painful relationship with the Spanish crown. There is a quiet lesson in that contrast too. The lender who believes too completely in his borrower's collateral is just as exposed as the borrower himself. What was the aftermath? By the time the 18th century opened, Spain had been visibly overtaken. The Dutch, those very rebels Philip II had sent armies to suppress, had built one of the most sophisticated financial systems on earth, complete with a central bank in Amsterdam, a stock exchange, a chartered overseas trading company, and merchant fleets that outtraded the Spanish in their own former waters. The English, on the other side of the Channel, were building a manufacturing economy and a navy that would in the next century leapfrog every European rival. Both nations had something Spain did not. They had productive economies underneath their finance. The Dutch did not have a Potosi. The English did not have a Cerro Rico. What they had was workshops, shipyards, weavers, merchants who reinvested, and governments that, for all their own flaws, did not have the luxury of treating extracted bullion as a substitute for a real productive base. The slow Spanish decline through the 18th century was not a single catastrophe. It was a long settling. The Bourbon kings who replaced the Habsburgs after the War of Spanish Succession tried to reform the system, tried to modernize, tried to rebuild industry behind tariff walls. Some of it worked. None of it restored Spain to the position the silver had briefly given it. By the time the Latin American independence movements of the early 19th century severed the last great colonial silver mines from the metropole, Spain had already been a second-rank European power for generations. The mountain had given everything it had. There was no mountain left to give. So, what is the ledger when we close the book on this story? It reads roughly like this. Over the course of roughly a century and a half, the Spanish crown extracted more bullion from a single colonial complex than any state had ever assembled. It poured that bullion into wars, courts, churches, and debt service. It declared sovereign default at minimum 9 times across the reigns of 3 kings. It hollowed its own productive sector. It enriched its rivals. It produced a price revolution that disrupted economies across Europe. And it ended its imperial century broker than it had begun. The lesson Spain wrote in silver ink is that wealth from the ground without industry above it is borrowed time. The flow can stop. The price can fall. The mountain can be torn open until there is no more easy ore. And when that happens, what remains is not the cumulative prosperity the flow seemed to imply. What remains is whatever a society built with the flow while it was flowing. The workshops, the schools, the institutions, the diversified base. Spain, by the time the flow slowed, had built relatively little of that with its bullion. It had spent the silver. It had not invested it. In 2026, we live with our own versions of this pattern. Petrostates whose budgets depend on a single commodity price holding steady. Sovereign borrowers whose collateral is future extraction. Economies that look enviably wealthy on a per capita chart, and that, on closer inspection, have not diversified beyond the ground beneath their feet. The mechanisms are more sophisticated now. Sovereign wealth funds, futures markets, central bank reserves, multilateral lenders. The underlying physics is older. A country that does not produce anything other than what it pulls from the earth is a country whose future is tied to the price of one thing. When that price moves the wrong way, the bankruptcies tend to come in clusters, the way they came for Philip II. I am not going to tell you which modern country fits the Spanish template most closely. That is a question for analysts and historians and the people who live in those economies to argue out. What I can tell you, because the ledger is clear, is that the pattern is older than oil, older than gas, older than lithium. It is older than the modern state. It is at least as old as 1545, when a llama herder slipped on a Bolivian hillside and pulled up a fistful of ore that would build and break an empire. The Spanish galleons stopped sailing in the early 19th century. The Cerro Rico is still standing, much reduced, much hollowed, still mined today by cooperatives working ore that the Spanish would have considered too poor to bother with. The silver real is in museum cases. The Fugger archives are studied by historians of finance. The asientos and the juros are footnotes in textbooks. And the question Spain's century leaves us with, the open question I want to leave you with tonight, is this. When a country today looks enviably wealthy on the basis of what it pulls from the ground, when its currency is strong, its sovereign debt cheap, its trade balance positive, how would we tell, from the outside, whether we are looking at genuine prosperity or at a slower version of the same flood? What would the warning signs be? What would Philip II to have wanted to know in 1557 in time to change the trajectory? I have my own guesses. So do you. The ledger is still open on that one. In the next entry of this ledger, we are going to walk through another empire that mistook a single revenue stream for permanent strength. And the moment its leaders realized too late that the river had changed course. Until then, look closely at the wealth around you. Ask where it actually comes from. Ask what would happen if the flow slowed. The answers, more often than we like to admit, are written in the ledgers of empires that thought they were too rich to fail.